Welcome to Canada's most irreverent talk show. This is the Andrew Lawton Show, brought to you by True North.
Hello and welcome to you all, Canada's most irreverent talk show. Here at the Andrew Lawton Show on this Monday, April 15th, back in the regular studio. Not that it matters to you, it matters to me. I get weird when I'm gesticulating and yelling in a hallway with a bunch of people around. I mean, I'm weird in general, so anyway, disregard. We were last week at the Canada Strong and Free Network's flagship conference for the Conservative movement in Ottawa. We had some great conversations, including with former Australian PM Tony Abbott, which we shared with you on Friday, and also a couple of fireside chats with New Brunswick Premier Blaine Higgs and Alberta Premier Danielle Smith. We'll have both of those in full for you this week. I'm excited about that. Today, we'll have my fireside chat with Danielle Smith, which ended up being a bit abbreviated from what it was supposed to be. So I had to come right out of the gate swinging for reasons I can explain a little bit later on, but that'll be coming up in just a few moments. We've also got our good friend Kris Sims, got to check in with her in person last week, and I met lots of really fun people at the conference, some listeners and viewers of the show. So thank you very much for all your support and for doing as I asked beforehand, which was coming up and saying hello and not doing it when I was in the middle of the show. So that was a lot of fun, but I want to just begin. This is a rather interesting development from the past week where the NDP, the federal NDP, which has been a stalwart defender of Justin Trudeau and his carbon tax, has started to equivocate a little bit. Now, I take this as a sign that the opposition to the carbon tax, which is not just being led by Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives, but by provincial premiers in a majority of provinces, including, to some extent, the NDP Premier Wab Kinew, that all of that opposition and resistance is working. That the federal NDP has now started to see that the polling data are not on their side, that Canadians do not want a carbon tax, that the Canadians are ultimately accepting the premise put forward by the Axe the Tax group, that this is a punitive, unnecessary carbon tax that is not supporting the government's stated climate objectives, but is causing economic harm. Now, the reason I bring this all up is because I want to just give this clip. Jagmeet Singh has been a carbon tax defender. Anytime there's been a motion on the carbon tax in the House of Commons, the NDP has voted against the Conservatives and with the Liberals. But then look at this exchange in a scrum last week at the Broadbent Institute conference in Ottawa.
Consumer carbon price.
Well, what we want to do is we want to lay out our vision, a new Democrat vision for how we tackle the climate crisis. And the thing that we are noticing is that we need big polluters to pay their fair share. We want to stop big polluters, and we want to make sure that there's a cost to that pollution so that we've got to stop them. We need government to take real action. It can't just be that our only approach to fighting the climate crisis is using free market solutions. That is not sufficient to meet the seriousness of what we're up against. And we also don't want this to turn into a question for everyday people that, am I worried about affordability or am I worried about the climate crisis? I don't want that to be the choice that workers and people are having to struggle with. I don't want the burden to fall on working people. So we want to lay out our plan, which addresses the real solutions and using government power to tackle big polluters, and that unites working people together.
So for the consumer price specifically though, do you want to get rid of it? Do you want to pause it? Do you want to stop the hikes? Like, what are you proposing here?
For our full plan, we're going to release that plan and we're going to present that to Canadians. So we don't have our full plan laid out, but we have some elements, the principles of our plan. And the principles I wanted to lay out today were that I find it problematic that the Liberals have set up a divisive system where they're dividing the country. Some people got an advantage very cynically. It was pretty obvious that it was for votes in the Atlantic region, and that's the wrong approach to fighting the climate crisis. It shouldn't be that certain regions get different treatment than other regions. I think that's wrong. I also think that Pierre Poilievre has spent a lot of time making it very clear that Pierre Poilievre's approach to have no climate plan, and really his plan is to let big polluters dump toxic waste into our rivers without any regulation. That's what's going to happen. Pollute our air, pollute the land. I think that is absolutely wrong. So I want to carve out a different path, a new Democrat path, one that acknowledges working people and acknowledges the need for fighting the climate crisis, and that it is going to be working people that bear the brunt of it. So we're starting to chart that course.
So there was a lot of, I mean, it was an NDP person speaking. There was a lot of nonsense, of course. But if you go through that, he's actually saying something quite intriguing there, which is that we don't have a plan. We'll let you know what the plan is, but he's not committing to this support for the consumer carbon tax. Now, where I would caution anyone who's getting all excited is that when people say we don't like the consumer carbon tax, what they mean is they generally would want to put a carbon tax on industry and corporations and all of that, which sounds good in paper. But when push comes to shove, any tax on any level of this process is going to filter down to the consumer. The consumer carbon tax has the one sort of advantage of it being marginally more transparent than all of these other ones. Because again, if you decide to tax, XYZ Corporation, XYZ Corporation, it was an American corporation the first time. If you decide to tax XYZ Corporation, that corporation is going to ultimately embed that tax in the cost of the good or service that it sells. So a carbon tax is a carbon tax. The only issue here is that it won't be as directly tied to your gas bill and home heating bill as it is in the case of the consumer tax. But so Jagmeet Singh, even so, is saying that the federal government's carbon tax, the federal carbon tax that the feds have been pushing on the provinces, that the provincial governments have been resisting, is something that he's not saying is necessarily in the NDP plan. He says it's not the be-all, end-all. That's actually quite a significant bit of movement, so much so that Justin Trudeau says he doesn't understand the NDP's stance on climate and carbon tax. Justin Trudeau says he doesn't understand it. Now, I will say Justin Trudeau saying he can't figure something out, not exactly breaking news. Jagmeet Singh saying something incoherent, also not breaking news. But it is still interesting nonetheless that these two who have been thick as thieves on the carbon tax and other economic policy for basically since 2021 are now starting to sow some fractures. Now, when push comes to shove, is the NDP going to pull its support of the Liberals? I suspect not. But the NDP are doing two things at once here. Number one, they're trying to back the Liberals, keep the Liberals in power, support Justin Trudeau as Prime Minister indefinitely. Number two, start paving the road to distance themselves from the carbon tax in the next federal election. Jagmeet Singh, mark my words, is going to come out in 2025, and he's going to have a climate change plan that has no consumer carbon tax, and he's going to claim he was always against it while supporting and propping up Justin Trudeau and his carbon tax every step of the way. That's what he's doing here. He sees the writing on the wall. He can read the polling data. He knows that Canadians are against this. The Canadians are turning on this carbon tax. They can't afford it. They don't like it, and it's becoming a big political win for Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives and everyone else. Like, it isn't just the Poilievre Conservatives. It's the NDP in Alberta now, most of the leadership candidates. It's the Liberals in New Brunswick. It's the Liberals in Ontario, the NDP in Manitoba, the Conservatives across the board. There's no one left defending this except the BC New Democrats, the Quebec Statists, which tend to span different parties, and Justin Trudeau's Liberals. Those are the three entities that seem to be able to live with the carbon tax, and Atlantic Canadians who sometimes don't care because they already got their carve out. But even then, Liberal Premier Andrew Furey did the right thing. He came out and said, no, I fundamentally oppose this. So this is an interesting fracture. Again, is it going to mean all that much in the grand scheme of things? Maybe, maybe not. But it is something that we definitely need to pay attention to. Now, do I believe that Jagmeet Singh is all of a sudden going to become some crusader for the common man against overzealous climate policy? Absolutely not. And I'd be remiss to not point out, it's not Canadian, but this story in Germany that came up. Do you know Germany's transport minister? His name is Wolfgang Wissing. Wolfgang Wissing. Now, I'm not a follower of the German transport minister, so I don't know too much about him, but I don't need to know much more because there is a climate policy fight underway in Germany right now. And as one stage in this fight, this is what the German government has promised: an indefinite driving ban on weekends. The politician, Mr. Wissing, says it forces us to consider considerable legal and factual uncertainties because they're trying to get their climate plan through and they don't know if it's going to go. He says that they need to reduce traffic to help meet their climate goals, and they can only do that through measures such as a, quote, comprehensive and indefinite driving ban on Saturdays and Sundays, unquote. This would be an amendment to the emissions reduction bylaw. It would look at all sectors together, and if the government is not meeting its emission reduction target, they have to do drastic extreme action, like, for example, banning you from driving your cars on the weekend. Now, this is particularly extreme. I don't know if it's going to go through or not. We saw last year or 2 years ago, the French government banned domestic air travel. And it's so fascinating to me that a couple of years ago, when you had some people popping up and saying, well, we saw what they did in the COVID realm, maybe they're going to give us climate lockdowns. And everyone said, oh, you're a conspiracy theorist. You're never going to have, movement restrictions because of climate. And then all of a sudden you have domestic air travel being outlawed in France. You have, in the case of Germany, the government floating the idea of not being able to drive your car on Saturdays and Sundays, not being able to drive on the weekend. So this is going to be, I think, an incredibly dangerous development. Now, again, when 15-minute cities, people were coming up to me for a few weeks last year and just asking me, 15-minute cities, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? And I said, hold on. If we're talking about just zoning and urban planning and trying to make communities walkable, I don't really have an issue. If we're talking about things that will fundamentally restrict mobility, I would have an issue with it. And again, even from that position, people were saying, you're being no one's trying to restrict mobility for climate. And then, well, here we go. Here we have the game, set, match right there. Well, let's talk about all of the things that we can expect on this front and more with our good friend Kris Sims from the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. We caught up with her in person last week. Back to our regularly scheduled program now. Kris, always good to talk to you. Did you have a good time at the conference last week?
Yes, it was lovely to see you in person, and I was front row center when you were speaking to Premier Danielle Smith. So just a little aside, people often do an awful lot of work at these conferences, and they'll prepare themselves, they'll prepare their remarks, and they usually don't have a picture from it. And so I always try to, if I can, take a nice picture of whoever is speaking and just send it to them, because it's always nice to have a memento. And it was nice seeing you interview the Premier about this. One little note there, what you were mentioning with the German minister. You're absolutely right. I'm of the same thinking of the government is often trying to restrict your mobility. There's usually a war on the car, so to speak, especially in urban centers. And
in UK, this has become like an all-out war where you have the government putting up these high emission zone cameras and then people going around and like taking them down. It was actually quite a thing for a while.
Yeah, exactly. And remember, that all started with toll roads that you could only get into the downtown core. And at first it was, so for road maintenance, and then it was for emissions. And now they've got these crazy cameras everywhere. It always seems to escalate until you force the government to stop the escalation. And I need to point this out with that German minister recommending this. This is a minister in the government of a G7 country musing aloud about not allowing his free citizens to drive their own privately owned cars. This is not some weird organization that is giving some advice to the government here or there on the back of a napkin. No, this was the minister in Germany, a very serious player country. So I did want to flag that and really highlight it, that we're getting there. Yeah, we had an excellent
if I can jump in on that, Kris,
Yeah.
You're absolutely right. And we've seen governments, for example, do things like you can only water your lawn every other day, depending on where you live, and these sorts of restrictions. And again, like anything else, it's that old, I hate quoting Al Gore, but it's the old frog in the pot of boiling water thing. If these little incremental encroachments on your liberty don't seem all that big. And, if the government has the authority to restrict your ability to drive on the weekend, they also have the ability to restrict your ability to drive on weekdays. And that's the whole point here, is that it will never stop at that, because especially when they tie it to emissions reductions, if they aren't meeting their emissions reduction goals, the rest of you plebs need to do it. And you better believe there's going to be some essential worker carve out where the minister himself can go around in his, motorcade or whatever, but you and I can't.
That's exactly right. There's a pivotal moment in Atlas Shrugged where the 20th Century Motor Company, which is the great novel, of course, by Ayn Rand, the 20th Century Motor Company has been taken over by these crazy statists, and people have to plead their case every year. Please, this is how many children I have. Please, this is how big my house is. This is what I need to be able to, afford everything. And so I can see ministers and ministries being set up to do this. Who is now essential? Why do you need to drive your car? Where exactly are you driving your car? What kind of groceries are you hauling in it? Like, see where this goes real fast. And so this is why, again, we always sound the alarm whenever government wants to get bigger. Sheila Gunn Reid, our mutual friend, said that she wants government to be small enough to drown it in a teacup. And this is why, because regardless of, if you like to vote green or if you like to plant flowers or if you like to drive your big rig, the government will control your life if you let it. So thank you very much for flagging that. That was new because we were so busy at the conference. I didn't even see that on Friday.
Speaking of the conference, and you mentioned my fireside chat with Premier Danielle Smith, I was looking at you out of the corner of my eye when I asked, I think, my first question, which people will see in a few moments, which was about the gas tax. And obviously people on this show will see the answer in a moment, but I just wanted to give you a sense of what you thought of her response to that, because I know this has been something you've been pounding on for a little while now, and I hadn't really heard her address head on.
I think they were your first 4 questions actually were along this line. So good on you.
Well, normally I do a wind up, but they ate into my time. So I had to just come out swinging, but
nice to see you, Premier. By the way, about this tax increase, but it's true. And, Premier Smith, she's a big girl. She's been in this game for a long time and she knows that her government increased the fuel tax. So it was really good that you asked her that. What I found interesting, and to be clear, big fan of Premier Danielle Smith. She's done a million very good things for Alberta, primarily, and I keep harping on this, keeping spending below the rate of inflation plus population growth. That sounds really nerdy and wonky, so the government is not getting the credit it needs for this. If they stick to this kind of spending restraint for the next generation, we will have hundreds of billions of dollars saved. So they're doing that very well. But you're right. They did fully increase their fuel tax. So for folks outside of Alberta, we typically have a provincial fuel tax on both gasoline and diesel that is 13 cents per liter. A few years back, then Premier Jason Kenney said, you know what? I'm going to reduce it every now and then based on the price of a barrel of oil. Premier Smith was elected leader within the party and thus premier. She looked around, realized everything was unaffordable and said, you know what? I'm going to decouple it really from the price of a barrel of oil and reduce it anyway. So we had 0 provincial fuel tax for an entire year in Alberta, and it was great. We had the lowest gas prices in the entire country. That's not so anymore. Manitoba is eating our lunch. NDP Premier Wab Kinew has had it down to 0 now since January 1st. So we're paying 13 cents per liter, back up again. And in Manitoba, they're paying 0 cents per liter for the provincial fuel tax. I hear what she's saying when she says things like, we need the funds, because governments will always say that they need the funds. She also said that they need it, and I'm paraphrasing her, that they need it for road maintenance. What I found very interesting about that is that the UCP government said in their budget document, Andrew, that they don't use it for road maintenance. I found this really surprising. So it's right in the page where they're announcing their $200 per year electric car tax. And they leave this little sentence in there saying, we do not allocate the provincial fuel tax to road maintenance, but we still see this as an issue of fairness for people who drive electric vehicles. That was such a strange admission. So, and then of course, obviously the premier doesn't sit there and write the budget document herself, but I think she made the same assumption that a lot of us do, is that it does go to road maintenance, but her own government says that it's not. So I don't think this fight is over. I think if the government is able to do their next quarterly budget update and review and see the books, and if they're in a surplus situation, it would be very, very, very good of them to reduce that fuel tax back down again. Because now, hey, a little secret just for you and all of your viewers, Ottawa, when we were just there a couple of days ago, it had slightly cheaper gas prices. I couldn't believe it.
Wow.
Yeah.
And that's with HST instead of just GST. And in general, I think the fact that it's always more in Ontario, especially in the city.
So it was around, if I'm guessing, I think it was around 152, 153 in Ottawa. I'm here in Lethbridge back again, and it's 162. Like, I've never seen it like this before. Wow. So yeah, it's people are kind of grinding their teeth at the pumps right now.
One thing I wanted to ask you about here is corporate welfare, which has been, typically it's been like the number one contributor to the Quebec GDP for many years. But corporate welfare, it's been under the microscope by the federal Conservatives, but not historically. I mean, Stephen Harper still was guilty of this in a number of cases. There was a fascinating story you flagged for me that the federal government isn't saying if companies will keep their job-creating promises. So all of these big, lofty goals they put out here about you give us this money, we're going to create this many jobs once they get the checks, once they get the subsidies. So we don't actually know if, Volkswagen, Stellantis, Ford, if all of these companies that have made these big promises will actually deliver on the jobs that they've said will be tied to this money.
Bingo. And so I don't know if I remembered to introduce you to our investigative journalist, Ryan Thorpe. He's an excellent reporter, and he's with the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Very mild-mannered, though, so he wouldn't have approached you and introduced himself.
I believe I ran into him in one of the hospitality suites.
He was probably wingman with Franco.
Maybe it was Franco that introduced me, but yes, I did meet him.
He would have been right next to Franco at the time. So we act as his interpreter, his extrovert interpreter. He did so much legwork on this, and I really wanted to give him a shout-out for this because he went through all sorts of spreadsheets. And so what I found, I almost laughed. So you're right. You set it up. You imagine no matter the color of the jersey that the politician's wearing, they do the big ribbon cutting and they kiss the babies and they say, this is delivering this many jobs because we're handing taxpayers' money out to fill in the blank. Ford or a solar company or Loblaws or whatever it is. It doesn't matter. Corporate welfare. The only little problem there is that they're not keeping the receipts. And the way it was described in the article is that, okay, say you get back the data from the government saying, this is how much money the company got. This is how many jobs were promised. And then there's a column there for jobs actually created. And almost always it's zero. And we're like, okay, this is, a little bit too good to be true as far as juiciness goes. So it can't possibly be zero. Like there are human beings working in these places once they're set up. But this is the kicker. They made it all zero because they're not required to keep track of it. Not one bit. They could hire 3 or they could hire 300. Doesn't matter, but it's taxpayers' money. So this was astonishing to a lot of people in the office that they have no requirements to keep the receipts on how many jobs are actually delivered once the cameras go home and the ribbons have been cut.
Well, quite something. And it's insane, too, because, you would never, if you were in the private sector and you were signing a contract with someone, I mean, what do? I give you this money, you give me this service. Part of the only justification for corporate welfare at all, like the only one, is job creation. That's the only way to justify it. Now, 9 times out of 10, you could look at this and say it would have been cheaper for you to actually just hand out the money on the street to people than put it in because it's enriching Volkswagen, Stellantis, and all of these things. But if they're not even required to fundamentally track the metric that the money is based on, what the heck's the point of it all?
Exactly. It's just shoveling it out the door, and it's to win favors and patronage. That's all it is. And it's disgusting no matter which party's doing it. And you're right. It doesn't seem to matter which government, which party's in power. This happens at the provincial level as well, right? We see corporate welfare at both federal and provincial levels. And for anybody who is cringing at that term, right? They think that it's derogatory to say corporate welfare. No, I'm almost positive it was Stephen Lewis, a very famous left-wing person who coined the term corporate welfare. So most folks in this game are using that term. And again, we almost never see any good return on investment. And to your point, if we saw person for person, dollar for dollar, we'd still oppose it because we think companies should be the ones paying for this sort of thing and not taxpayers because taxpayers have no say. But at least then there'd be receipts. But there's not even any receipts. These columns were apparently zero in all of the spreadsheets that they were handing back to us.
Wow, that's crazy. Good stuff on this. Great work to Ryan and to your whole team there. Kris Sims, we'll talk to you next week. Thanks so much for coming on.
You bet.
All right, we are going to hear from a couple of members of the Alberta government now. Coming up in a little bit, we'll have Minister Devon Dreeshen on, caught up with him on the sidelines of the Canada Strong and Free Conference. But I also wanted to share with you my on-stage fireside chat with Premier Danielle Smith. Well, thank you. Don't let the media tell the story is the great cue for the journalist to come on stage, by the way. So Thank you for that. Just to give a bit of disclosure, Premier Smith and I have known each other for many years. We used to work together in radio, and now I'm a podcaster and she's the Premier, so take from that what you will.
But whenever Andrew would sub in for me when I was on the air, when I came back, I got a ream of texts saying, "Oh man, I like Andrew so much better. Can't we have him instead?"
Yeah, I was her guest host, which I'd have to check the Constitution, but I believe that means I'm acting Premier in Alberta, because I've never formally been released from that. But you ended on the carbon tax, and I spoke about this a fair bit yesterday with Premier Higgs, who I'm glad was not tired of me after that interview, that he's returned. And you have said so much and have been such a strong voice on this, and that comment about it being a sin tax on productivity I quite like. But I have to ask how those arguments do not apply equally to the gas tax, which in Alberta has gone up this year, has gone up again within the last couple of weeks. It treats something that for a lot of Albertans is necessary, driving around, as though it's an elective choice.
Well, you'll see that we added a tax on electric vehicles. And when we put that $200 tax in, we calculated it as being essentially the equivalent of what an average driver would spend in fuel tax, so that electric vehicles are paying their fair share of our road maintenance. That's what the connection is in most provinces between the tax we charge. That's originally how it began. And then the federal government layered on their 10-cent a litre tax. And of course, Stephen Guilbeault doesn't want to build roads anymore. We're 0 for 9 in our province in getting cost share. I don't know if Premier Higgs has had any better luck on that. But then they've also now levied on, I think, what it amounts to 17.6 cents in the carbon tax. And then on top of that, they charge GST on all of it. So they're charging tax on tax, which is, I think, another 7.5 cents at prices the way they are today. So yes, we do accept 13 cents a litre to pay for roads, and they accept 35 cents to essentially pay for nothing. So I would say that I cannot sacrifice our need to gain revenue, to build roads, to make room for them to continue with the punitive tax that does nothing. Because a couple of things I'd say. The argument that they make that it will encourage people to change behavior, they completely undermine, because Stephen Guilbeault admitted that the carbon tax isn't going to have an effect until 2060, which means we're all paying punitive taxes until then, and there really just aren't options. I was talked to any of the automakers and the auto dealers, that if you wanted to go out and switch to an electric vehicle tomorrow to avoid the tax, you couldn't, because there aren't enough of them being produced, and the infrastructure isn't in your home to do it, and the infrastructure isn't there for public charging station to do it. Hydrogen vehicles as well. We have 100 of them in Alberta. We've got a 5,000 car challenge, but if you wanted to go out and buy a hydrogen zero emissions vehicle, you couldn't, because they're not producing enough of them. If you wanted, in my province, where I think 90% of the homes are heated with natural gas, if you simply couldn't switch to a heat pump because they don't work in minus 35, and you can't get insurance if you do without having a backup of some other type of heating. So all it is then, if there isn't a reasonable way to switch to an equal or lower cost option, then all it is a punitive tax on consumers. That's the reason why they're different.
But when the Alberta, fair. But when the Alberta government offered fuel tax relief, those issues you described were still there, and it was a recognition that life was unaffordable. And unaffordability comes in layers. There's inflation, carbon tax, fuel tax, general cost of living. So the crisis of affordability is still there.
Well, let me say, when we brought through our relief program, our gas prices in our province were $1.89. Mm-hmm. So our tax is 13 cents. So that would have taken it down from $1.89 down to $1.76. And right now, today, gas prices in Alberta are $1.58. So we will continue with our program that when oil prices go beyond $90, we'll take that tax off again. In fact, I'd love to see the federal government do the same. Make it variable, so that when the prices get up above a certain level, we're all paying more because of that. Take the tax off at that point, so that you're not adding to the problem. And I should mention that we remain, along with Saskatchewan, the second lowest in the country in our overall price of fuel. Manitoba followed our lead, reduced the carbon tax, or took their fuel tax off after Wab Kinew got elected. But the other provinces, I think British Columbia, who are the poor souls from British Columbia facing $1.98?
They couldn't afford to fly here, actually. That's why there aren't more of them.
That's why. So I would say we are trying to be variable because we also have to run a balanced budget. And that's the first promise that I made to Albertans. And that extra 4 cents a litre that we added back on just on April the 1st, that's the difference between us running a $400 million surplus or not. So when those additional revenues come in, absolutely. Our strategy is to give the money back to Albertans.
A couple of nights ago, Boris Johnson was on this stage with Tony Abbott, and they had a spirited discussion on climate policy. And Boris Johnson had made a comment, which some people have asked me about, and I wanted to get your thoughts on, that basically it's Pascal's wager. So we should accept that, oh, maybe global warming's a big hoax, maybe it's an existential threat, but it is, he said basically there are no costs to acting as though it is something that is a grave and pressing threat. And then I noted, I think it was yesterday on Twitter, Stephen Guilbeault had met Boris Johnson and was praising him, which is inherently the endorsement you don't want. But I reject that premise, and I assume you do, Premier, as well, that going along with this, and to be frank, going along with what Boris Johnson's government did in the UK is without cost.
Well, if you try to accelerate things, as Stephen Guilbeault wants to do, net zero power grid by 2035, net zero vehicles by 2035, net zero homes, that's the new approach. You think this accelerator fund is altruism? It's not. They want net zero homes, which I think will ultimately mean no one's allowed to hook up to natural gas. You all have to have heat pumps. You're not allowed to be able to have electricity that comes from an emitting source. That's where I think they're going with that. So I'm already, if you can imagine, what's it going to cost you to buy a new car? What's it going to cost you to change out your home heating? What are the extra costs associated with building net zero construction? What's the cost associated with taking all of our home heating off of the natural gas system and putting it onto the electrical grid? One of our leaders in Alberta says that's a $70 billion cost. What's the cost associated with upgrading our grid so that you can plug in more than 2 electric vehicles in a home? Because if you put 2 vehicles on a 12-home city block, your transformer will blow. So you need to upgrade your transformer, which is $40,000. And that right now is going to the cost of the third guy who ends up buying the electric car. So how much is that transformed over our entire system? Probably hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars. I think it was $1.6 trillion, in fact, that was estimated to implement the Guilbeault vision of everything being on the power grid, your car, your heating, as well as current electricity from all sources, including industrial, and then having all of that be from non-emitting sources. So yeah, it's very costly when you're trying to do that. Now, the approach I would take is I have no problem with a transition away from emissions. We do this all the time. We found clean ways to be able to take sulfur dioxide out of coal plants so that we could have address issues of acid rain. We found ways to find an alternative for chlorofluorocarbons to address ozone. And I believe that we're already seeing with carbon capture, utilization, and storage and some of the incredible mines that we have, that we'll be able to find a way to capture the CO2 and turn it into useful products, which has been the history of our industry. But it is a transition away from emissions. It is not a transition away from the production of oil and natural gas. A barrel of oil provides 6,000 different products for us now. How are we going to be able to have lubricants? How are we going to be able to have petrochemicals? How are we going to be able to have food-safe materials? How are we going to be able to have medical safe materials if we don't have petrochemicals? How are we going to have roads to drive our zero emissions vehicles on, because they're made of asphalt, which comes from the bitumen that is produced in Alberta? So the approach that I believe the left is taking is defeatist. It doesn't look at the incredible innovation that we have, the brilliant minds that we have, who are able to take what are traditional waste streams and turn them into something valuable. And I see Michael Binion is here too. He has done some great work in elevating and showcasing, same with 2nd Street, I don't know if Colin Craig is here, elevating and showcasing the kind of products that are being made out of CO2. So in my province, Heidelberg is a cement company that is going to take the CO2, embed it in their cement, and make a stronger concrete. And there'll be the first net zero cement plant in the entire world. Dow Chemical has, yeah, truly. Dow Chemical is taking the CO2, working with a company called Linde. The Linde is creating hydrogen, and then they're burying the CO2. They'll be the first net zero petrochemical plant. And then on top of that, we've already got Air Products, which is taking the CO2, burying it, and doing net zero hydrogen. That's what an emissions-reduced world looks like. But all of that takes time. You cannot snap your fingers and have innovation. But I think it's our job as government to champion what it is the industry is doing, to support them so everybody knows that there's a different way of doing it. Like, that's the theme. The guys on the left have a single-minded approach to how they want to do things. They identify a problem, they propose solutions that make it worse, and then they fearmonger that, oh, look at those guys on the other side, they want to do nothing at all. Couldn't be further from the truth. We identify the problem, we identify solutions that will actually work, and then we support our industry and those nonprofit players that we believe will get there.
Making it worse is actually the headline of the broadband conference just down the road there. Well, you said energy transition, so I guess transition is a logical segue to the next topic here. Let's discuss your approach to gender in Alberta, because I discussed with Premier Higgs yesterday how New Brunswick was the first to really go into this terrain, but Alberta was the most extensive in terms of what you proposed, because you didn't just talk about parental rights and consent and knowledge in an education context, you also extended it to sports and also to the healthcare sector when interventions, medical interventions are concerned. And we haven't seen the legislation, so I'm hoping you can provide a little bit more detail in what you hope to achieve. And one particular aspect of this is the protection of single-sex spaces, so women's shelters and also prisons, or jails rather, in Alberta. I mean, are you proposing something where biologically male inmates who identify as female would not be permitted to go into female jails?
Well, look. Let me tell you my starting point, because I've talked with many transgender individuals over the years, from the first time I got into politics all the way through when I was on radio, until as recently as yesterday, because we've got transgender conservatives that are fellow travelers with us who want to give us advice on implementing the policy. But the issue that I began with was, are we giving good medical care to those who do transition? Because in our province, we don't do the surgeries. We have them have people fly out to Quebec to receive surgery, and then they fly back home, and we don't have good post-operative care. In fact, a lot of these surgeries have complications, and so that was one of the starting points. Those who have decided to transition as well need lifelong support for hormone treatment and also lifelong support for the consequences that might happen of doing that transition. And so then that's where it began, is how do we give good medical care for those as adults who make that transition? But then you have to have the conversation, at what age is the right age to make those decisions? And if you look at Dr. Hilary Cass, the Cass report was just released in the UK. And she was this is the most comprehensive review of the medical literature and the science behind this. And what she discovered, quite frankly, is there isn't very good science. So notwithstanding what the left like to tell us, there isn't good long-term data about how many kids go on puberty blockers and whether it impacts their future fertility and at what age. There isn't long-term information about what happens to those kids by the time they reach 25. Do they continue with the transition? Do they detransition? They don't do that kind of study. And so they've said, let's take a pause. We're not going to assign puberty blockers as a matter of course, and we're going to be a lot more deliberate in going through and making sure that you're part of a medical team when those decisions are made, as well as that there's long-term studies on it. So we're watching what the emerging scientific evidence is in the world. This is science. The left says they believe in science. This is what science looks like as you follow the information where it goes. So that's where we began. And then, of course, because the first step of transitioning is changing name, changing pronouns, dressing on the opposite gender, you cannot be out to your entire school community, and the only people who aren't allowed to know are your parents. You can't have that.
And that's important context, but
so,
will that protect single-sex spaces?
Let me answer your question. So one of the transgender individuals I spoke with, it has not transitioned below. Mm-hmm. And she likes to go for spa days with her girlfriends. And there's locker rooms where she just told me, like, it wouldn't be the same experience for me if I had to be in a separate locker room and not be able to be out with my girlfriends. I think the issue is modesty. that you cannot, if you have not been fully transitioned, then you shouldn't be exposing yourself in female-only spaces, because no one should know. You should either be behind in a washroom stall, or you should show modesty, and then it doesn't become an issue. It's when when women feel that their private spaces, when they're alone and they're naked, that's when they want to make sure that their places are protected. So at the moment, I have not seen anything. I've not seen anything in Alberta that leads me to believe I have to do anything about that. So I'm not going in that direction.
And is that same for jails as well?
Correct. I haven't seen anything. I mean, I'm watching what's happening internationally and what's happening in the rest of the country. But in our own province, I haven't seen anything that rises to it. Because remember, in provincial jails, I think it's 2 years less a day that you serve. So I have not observed any emergence of problems that might happen that I'm seeing elsewhere.
As we close here, what's the message to Alberta, or from Alberta to Ottawa, that you want to bring while you're here?
Well, you may have seen this week, I introduced the Stay Out of My Backyard bill. It's the Provincial Priorities Act. My message to Ottawa is that federal politicians, and the Prime Minister in particular, should do his job and stop trying to do my job. That's what the message is. And I don't know if Premier Higgs would said the same thing, but when we meet as premiers, the really interesting thing is it doesn't matter whether it's NDP or Liberal or Progressive Conservative or UCP or Saskatchewan Party. We all come from different parties and different perspectives, but we are united in that the federal government should stay focused on the things which they need to do. There's lots of things they need to do. They need to shore up national defense so that we're not an international embarrassment. They need to make sure that our foreign policy is aligned with our allies instead of our enemies. They need to make sure that they're expanding international trade so every single one of our 10 provinces and territories can get our product to market. They need to build critical infrastructure like the Trans Mountain Pipeline, which is going to be getting to the finish line. That is the kind of things that they should do more of. They should be building ports. They should be building rail lines. They should be building highways, Stephen Guilbeault. They should be making sure that they are living up to their obligation and their treaties with First Nations. They should be funding healthcare on reserve, mental health and addiction treatment on reserve, water on reserve, building out economies on reserve. They should make sure that the value of our dollar is not diminishing internationally. They should make sure that they can process passports efficiently. They should make sure that the Pearson Airport is a lovely experience to go through, and that all of our airports are operating efficiently. There is no shortage of things that the Prime Minister can do. It's not a boring job. So when you see in Alberta that we are going to take a posture more like Quebec, which is no thank you, we don't need your policy advice on school lunch programs, on pharmacare, on dental care, that is just give us the money and trust that we'll be able to deliver on this. That's the approach that we're going to take, and we're going to be pretty vocal about doing so, and I hope to see some of the other premiers do it.
Premier Danielle Smith. Well, I always like catching up with Premier Danielle Smith. Now, I at the beginning, you heard me tell a joke, my old deputy premier, or my acting premier radio guest host joke. I wasn't going to do that because I've done that joke like 3 times now on stage with her. But Franco Terrazzano said I had to do it. And not that he lords over me in any like larger than life way where I do everything he says. I do most things because he's a smart guy. But he said, Andrew, you got to do, it's my favorite joke of yours. You got to do the joke. So I did the joke. I apologize for not getting some new material, but nevertheless, that's what happened there. So it was a fun joke. It was a fun joke the first time. The second time, the third, I'm not sure about the third time. Maybe it starts to lose its zeal at that point. But in any event, I wanted to go to another side of this discussion here. Premier Danielle Smith mentioned near the end of our chat that idea of really Alberta telling the federal government to mind your own beeswax, as the old saying goes, to stay out of its business. And it was a topic I got to to explore in a little bit more detail that afternoon with Transport Minister Devon Dreeshen. Now, again, remember for context here, Stephen Guilbeault once infamously said, as referenced by Danielle Smith there, that, well, maybe the federal government's just not going to invest in any more roads. And then he kind of backtracked that a little bit. But it was a good point to get into a discussion with Alberta's Transport Minister on, Minister Devon Dreeshen. Joining me today.
Thanks for having me on your show. Really appreciate it.
So obviously, there's been a fair bit of strain on Alberta's relationship with Ottawa over the last couple of years, but we've seen even some flashpoints on this in the last couple of months. What is it you've brought here to Ottawa? What's the message you're trying to send? What is it you were trying to get out of this trip?
So roads. We have Minister Guilbeault that has gone out in the media saying that the federal government isn't going to be funding new roads. He clarified those comments by saying, well, not just any big new roads. And that's actually caused a lot of concern, not just in Alberta, but in other provinces, and even within First Nations across this country, because obviously it's the responsibility of the federal government to be building roads and maintaining roads on First Nations. And we actually had a delegation of the Ochese First Nation, as well as Clearwater County, the county that surrounds the First Nation, to advocate for a road project that we have provincial dollars, municipal dollars, we just need federal dollars, but for years we've been getting blocked. And those types of comments from Minister Guilbeault saying that the federal government has no interest in building roads really has a lot of people really concerned about that direction by the federal government.
Yeah, and despite the pseudo backtrack on that, I think it does show a pretty big sense of misunderstanding how life is in Alberta. I mean, certainly in cities like Calgary and Edmonton, you have mass transit systems, people are able to use those, but not year-round in some cases. And then you also look at rural Alberta, where you can't just say, well, we don't need the road. And that just seems to be an utter mismatch here. And is it a gaffe or is it accidental honesty?
I think it's a lack of understanding of how rural Alberta truly is. This specific road and so many in Alberta, there's one way in and out for people that live in that community. And obviously they had a bad forest fire last year, so even on safety egress, it's not just a smooth way to get to town or get to the hospital or doctor or get to school, but it's a life or death situation of being able to, in the case of a wildfire, to have evacuation. It's a gravel road that needs to be paved, so the dust that kicks up and the unsafety or the lack of safety on this road because it hasn't been repaved is a huge issue for that area. And I think people just don't understand, because in towns and cities there's lots of ways to get around, but when there's one way in and out, I just think the federal government doesn't understand that in rural Alberta.
I know there's obviously been a fair bit of difficulty with your government and Stephen Guilbeault in particular for a range of issues. Have you found with your federal counterpart on the transport file that there's at least been a fairly constructive relationship, or has it really been like pulling teeth to get any cooperation from the feds?
Well, I've said this at federal, provincial, territorial meetings before. If Alberta was a hockey team when it came to transportation, and our power play was the National Trade Corridor Fund, which has been a huge advantage to have within the country, Alberta's 0 for 9. So if that was our power play, that'd be a pretty bad power play. And I think people would ask lots of questions about what's going on. So that's something that we're going to continue to advocate for. I've met with Minister Rodriguez to really push the renewal of that National Trade Corridor Fund, because it's been fully allocated, even though there's a couple years left on it. So we want to make sure that Alberta, we at least get our money back when it comes to the transfers that we give to the federal government.
When you talk about national trade, I mean, it's important to note that there are still barriers that exist on interprovincial trade, which people don't really realize are front and center. And I was wondering if you had anything on that you'd like to see some movement on.
So we actually, before our election in Alberta, we signed an agreement with Saskatchewan, Manitoba. We call it our Prairie MOU, to work on harmonizing our capital plans on road projects that come to the border, as well as look at regulation that we can try to eliminate the borders across our provinces to make sure that it's easy for big nation building projects to finally be built again, to kind of de-risk politically the approval process. So that actually spawned on work with BC, the 3 Prairie provinces, and the 3 territories to work together on a similar type of agreement. We'd love to see the federal government at those talks, because obviously national trade and interprovincial trade is a federal jurisdiction. But we're not waiting for the federal government to do that. In Alberta, we're taking the lead, and we'll see what happens on a lot of these negotiations that we're having with other provinces.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that. I mean, there have been a lot of issues where we've seen, especially between Alberta, Saskatchewan, a lot of cooperation on areas where the federal government is either not present or is working against what you guys want. And certainly on some issues, like the carbon tax, you have provincial government saying, hey, we want a meeting, and the federal government not wanting to grant that. Are you able to do what you're trying to do without the federal government? Do you have an option to really do an end run around the feds, or are you really at their mercy on some of this?
Well, obviously, with the Constitution, we have a lot of latitude to do what we need to do to promote Alberta and to protect and make sure that our economy is strong. But it's always great to have strength in numbers, whether it's Saskatchewan, Manitoba, BC, Quebec, Ontario, the maritime provinces, to be able to join forces to say, the federal government has a role to be able to partner with provinces on certain issues, but the federal government should stay in their lane at the end of the day.
Minister, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
The federal government should stay in its lane. That's basically, I mean, if I ever run for office, that's like the campaign slogan right there. Federal government should stay in its lane. And that's true. I mean, if you're a federal politician, you shouldn't want to go. You'll have enough to do without having to go outside your lane. And if you're a provincial politician, you need to, with just an iron fist, respect and demand respect for your jurisdiction. That is what the Federalist Project is based on. And I think it's basically been a failure on Justin Trudeau's part. So that does it for us for today. We'll have my interview with Premier Blaine Higgs later this week, as well as some of the other chats we had with some fascinating people on the sidelines of the Canada Strong and Free Network Conference. So do stay tuned for that. Let me know what you think in the comments. And please subscribe to True North. We love to hear from you. We love to know that you are in our corner, especially with all of the forces working against us with big tech and government censorship. So thank you, God bless, and good day to you all.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.